a revered lord of the realm, celebrated for shaping modern Britain alongside Winston Churchill, commanding the respect of millions from the grand benches of the House of Lords, a compromised, trembling addict, serving as a desperate political shield for London's most notoriously violent mafia boss. How did the moral voice of the British establishment willingly surrender his entire empire to the ruthless, blood-stained grip of an East End gangster? The architecture of Boothby's eventual destruction was forged decades before his public fall. Born at the dawn of the 20th century, Boothby was bred for power. His connection to Churchill was not merely casual. He operated at the center of the defining conversations that shaped modern Britain. In the 1950s and 60s, he pioneered the role of the celebrity politician. Millions tuned in to watch his charismatic appearances on panel shows. He was witty, brilliant, and deeply respected. Yet the 1960s in London was a city of severe contradictions. The cultural revolution of swinging London was beginning to explode, bringing new fashion, music, and rebellion. However, the legal and moral structures of the state remained brutally rigid. Homosexuality was a criminal offense. Until the Sexual Offenses Act of 1967, any sexual act between men, even in the absolute privacy of one's home, could lead to a devastating prison sentence, public ruin, and total ostracization. For a man in Boothby's position, exposure did not just mean the end of a career, it meant the end of his life as he knew it. This environment of fear did not erase homosexuality. It merely forced it underground. A vibrant clandestine scene existed, heavily populated by the upper classes who used their wealth and private clubs as a shield. Within this hidden, whispered world, Boothby harbored a specific and deeply dangerous compulsion. He was drawn to what the slang of the era called rough trade. Rough trade was the intense attraction of wealthy upper-class men to working class, often rugged and frequently dangerous men. For a man like Boothby, an intellectual suffocated by the polite, sterile protocols of the House of Lords, the danger was the point. It was an escape from the unbearable pressure of his public perfection. The dynamic of rough trade is built on a volatile power imbalance. Boothby held all the political and social capital, but in the shadows he surrendered entirely to the raw, unfiltered physical power of the men he sought out. It was a toxic addiction, and it was the exact vulnerability that would lead him straight into a trap. On the other side of London, ruling the East End with iron and blood, were the Kray twins. Reggie and Ronnie Kray were the unchallenged kings of organized crime. They ran sophisticated protection rackets, illegal gambling dens, and orchestrated acts of extreme theatrical violence. But they were not street-level thugs. They craved legitimacy and glamour. They cultivated a celebrity image, posing with actors, singers, and lords, actively trying to blur the lines between the criminal underworld and high society. Ronnie Kray was the more unstable of the two. Diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic, his capacity for violence was unpredictable and terrifying. Crucially, Ronnie was openly homosexual within his own criminal circle, an extreme rarity in the hyper-masculine, unforgiving world of professional crime. He did not hide his preferences, he weaponized them. Ronnie was the ultimate manifestation of rough trade. He was brutal, unrefined, and lethal. To Boothby, Ronnie was the perfect monster. The attraction was a fatal collision of class, suppressed identity, and a mutual desire for control and submission. They crossed paths in the late 1950s, introduced through the twilight network of gambling clubs where politicians and gangsters quietly rubbed shoulders, Boothby saw an intoxicating thrill. Ronnie Kray saw an unprecedented asset. A lord of the realm, a friend of Churchill, was an asset that could buy the Krays the one thing their money and violence could not: political immunity. Ronnie began to cultivate Boothby methodically. He did not just offer himself, he offered an entire ecosystem of indulgence. The peer was invited to private, lavish sex parties at apartments controlled by the Krays. These gatherings were not spontaneous acts of hedonism. They were calculated setups. Ronnie used his extensive underworld network to supply young working-class men for Boothby. He fed the politician's addiction, ensuring that Boothby plunged deeper and deeper into the lifestyle he could never publicly acknowledge. While Boothby lost himself in the intoxicating freedom of these clandestine nights, the trap was springing shut. The Krays were businessmen of the most ruthless order, and they were systematically collecting leverage. During these parties, photographs were taken. They captured Lord Boothby, the moral voice of conservative Britain, engaged in highly illegal, intimate acts with young men supplied by the Mafia. The moment those camera shutters clicked, the nature of the relationship permanently mutated. The photographs were the ultimate currency of blackmail. Boothby was no longer a willing participant in a dangerous romance. He had become a political hostage. The gangsters now owned a piece of the British establishment. Ronnie Kray did not hesitate to use his new weapon. The demands started quietly but carried the weight of total destruction. The Mafia boss required his high society lover to act as a shield. When Kray associates faced police scrutiny, or when their questionable business ventures required a veneer of legitimacy, Boothby was forced to step up. A respected peer of the realm, a man whose voice shaped national policy, was coerced into taking the floor of the House of Lords to defend the interests of organized crime. He had to champion their associates and deflect attention from their rackets, burning his own credibility to buy their silence. By day, Boothby sat in Parliament and appeared on television, projecting the image of a resolute, untroubled leader. By night, he was drowning in anxiety, isolated by a secret he could not share, and beholden to a violent psychopath. The emotional toll was catastrophic. Ronnie Kray was incapable of genuine affection. He was cold, transactional, and prone to violent mood swings. Boothby sought an escape from his rigid life, but instead, he built himself a more terrifying prison. He began to rely heavily on alcohol and medication just to survive the cognitive dissonance of his existence. He was a man split in two, waiting for the inevitable moment when his two worlds would violently collide. That moment arrived with devastating force in July 1964. The Sunday Mirror, a mass circulation tabloid, published a front-page expose that sent shock waves through the country. The headline was a sledgehammer: "Peer and a Gangster, Yard Inquiry." The article stopped just short of printing Boothby's name, but it didn't need to. It described a household name peer, detailing his political history and high-profile television career, who was engaged in a homosexual relationship with a well-known underworld figure. To anyone operating in London's political, media, or legal circles, the identity was unmistakable. The secret was out. The highest echelons of British society were directly linked to the lowest, most violent criminal elements, united by illegal sexual acts. The public was electrified by the scandal, but behind the closed doors of Whitehall and the gentlemen's clubs of Pall Mall, there was absolute panic. The ruling elite realized immediately that this was not just about Lord Boothby's personal ruin. If a man so deeply embedded in the establishment, so closely tied to the legacy of Winston Churchill, was exposed as a compromised homosexual under the thumb of the Mafia, the collective moral authority of the entire ruling class would evaporate. It would validate every suspicion the working class held about the hypocrisy and corruption of their leaders. The conservative government and the broader establishment realized they could not allow this story to survive. It was an existential threat. And so the machinery of the state was quietly, brutally mobilized to crush the truth. The establishment did not panic. Panic implies a loss of control. When the Sunday Mirror hit the newsstands, the reaction within Whitehall, the elite gentlemen's clubs, and the headquarters of MI5 was cold, calculated, and instantaneous. They recognized the threat not as a moral failing of one man, but as a structural breach of their entire class. The strategy was immediate containment and total suppression. The weapon of choice was not physical violence, but the British legal system, specifically the draconian libel laws. In the 1960s, British libel law was fundamentally designed to protect the reputations of the wealthy and powerful from the scrutiny of the press. The burden of proof lay entirely on the publisher. If you called a lord a criminal, you had to prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt in a courtroom controlled by other lords. The Sunday Mirror had the story right, but proving it in court was another matter entirely. The men who attended those clandestine parties would never testify. The young men supplied by the Krays would be silenced by fear or money. Ronnie Kray certainly would not take the stand. The newspaper was utterly isolated. Behind the scenes, immense pressure was brought to bear on Cecil King, the chairman of the Mirror Group. The message delivered to him by the highest echelons of the political elite was unambiguous. Retract the story, apologize, and pay, or we will bankrupt your newspaper and destroy your personal standing in London society. This was state-sanctioned extortion, executed in tailored suits and wood-paneled rooms. The intelligence services were equally complicit. MI5 had been tracking the Kray twins for years. They knew about the gambling clubs, the protection rackets, and the extortion. They undoubtedly knew about the compromising photographs of Lord Boothby. MI5 possessed the intelligence to dismantle the Kray's operation and expose the blackmail. They chose not to. They calculated that protecting a prominent conservative peer, and by extension the government's credibility, was more important than breaking a violent mafia syndicate. They allowed a hostile criminal enterprise to maintain leverage over a voting member of the House of Lords. They chose to protect the lie. While the machinery of the state fought a shadow war on his behalf, Lord Boothby was disintegrating. The week following the publication was an agonizing psychological descent. He was trapped in a terrifying limbo. The state demanded that he fight, that he deny everything, that he stand as the unblemished victim of a malicious smear. But Boothby knew the truth. Worse, he knew that Ronnie Kray held the physical proof of that truth. He had to walk into the House of Lords, nod to his colleagues, and project the aura of an outraged gentleman. But his mind was consumed by a singular paralyzing fear. What would Ronnie do? The gangster was notoriously volatile, prone to fits of rage and paranoid delusions. If Boothby followed the establishment's script and denied the relationship, would Ronnie view it as a betrayal? Would the photographs be mailed to rival newspapers? Would there be a violent reprisal? Boothby was caught between two ruthless entities. The British government demanded his complete submission to their narrative of denial. The criminal underworld demanded his continued utility as a political shield. He had zero autonomy. He was a passenger in his own life, strapped into a vehicle hurtling toward a cliff, entirely dependent on the men who were driving. He sought refuge in alcohol. The drinking, which had always been a crutch, became a necessity. It was the only way to silence the cognitive dissonance of his existence. He was a revered intellectual who was utterly outsmarted by a street thug. He was a champion of freedom who was entirely enslaved. The breaking point, the moment that defined the rest of his life, occurred under the glare of television studio lights. The establishment needed a public execution of the rumor. They arranged for Boothby to appear on national television, offering him a platform to clear his name. It was a massive gamble. If he faltered, if he showed a flicker of hesitation or guilt, the entire cover-up would collapse. Boothby sat in the studio chair. The cameras rolled. He was asked directly about the Sunday Mirror allegations. He did not hesitate. He deployed the booming, aristocratic voice that had made him famous. He called the article a wicked and malicious lie. He stated with absolute, unwavering conviction that he had only a casual, fleeting acquaintance with the Kray brothers, related strictly to mundane business matters. He looked directly into the lens and delivered a master class in deception. It was a performance of extraordinary nerve, but it was born of absolute cowardice. He lied to millions of people because the alternative, facing his own nature, facing the law, and facing the wrath of his peers, was too terrifying to contemplate. In that moment on television, Boothby chose survival over truth. He cemented his pact with the establishment. The performance worked. The public, conditioned to defer to the aristocracy, believed him. The Sunday Mirror, already battered by legal threats behind closed doors, capitulated completely. They printed a groveling, unprecedented front-page apology. They paid Lord Boothby £40,000 in damages, a staggering sum in 1964. It was the most humiliating defeat in the history of British tabloid journalism. On paper, Lord Boothby had won a total victory. He had defeated the press, secured a massive payout, and maintained his position in the House of Lords. His colleagues congratulated him. The crisis appeared to be averted. But Boothby knew better. The £40,000 was blood money. The apology was a fiction. The victory was hollow. He returned to his opulent apartment, poured a drink, and faced the devastating reality of his new existence. The cover-up had saved his title, but it had permanently eradicated his freedom. He was now a high-profile asset managed by the state, living on borrowed time. The photographs still existed. Ronnie Kray was still out there watching the television broadcast, watching his rough trade lover lie to the nation. Boothby had successfully built a fortress of lies around himself, but he was locked on the inside. He had survived the immediate blast, but the radiation of the scandal would slowly, inevitably poison the rest of his days. The establishment had proven that they could bury the truth, but they could not erase the fact that an East End gangster still held the leash of a British lord. The £40,000 libel payout sat in his bank account. It was the highest sum ever awarded in British legal history at the time. To the public, it was the ultimate vindication. To Lord Boothby, it was a severance package from reality. He had successfully sued the truth and won. The Sunday Mirror had been humiliated, their editors broken, their journalistic integrity traded for survival. The rest of Fleet Street got the message instantly. Lord Boothby was untouchable. The British establishment had drawn a line in the sand, and the press had retreated. But the silence of the newspapers did not mean safety. It meant isolation. Boothby returned to his life in the House of Lords. He resumed his television appearances. He attended the right dinners, shook the right hands, and projected the booming, jovial authority that the public demanded of him. It was a flawless performance, and it was killing him. He knew exactly what Ronnie Kray was doing while he gave his grand speeches. Kray had watched the television broadcast. He had watched his rough trade lover, the aristocrat who paid for East End boys and begged for rough treatment, look directly into the camera and deny his existence. Did Ronnie Kray feel betrayed? No, he felt victorious. By forcing Boothby to lie so publicly, so categorically, Ronnie had locked the trap permanently. Before the broadcast, Boothby was just a politician with a secret. After the broadcast, he was a perjurer. He was a fraud. He had used the legal system to extort a newspaper. If the truth surfaced now, the scandal would not merely be about homosexuality. It would be about a massive, state-sanctioned criminal conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. Boothby was now a co-conspirator in his own blackmail. Ronnie Kray didn't need to release the photographs. The threat was infinitely more powerful than the execution. Boothby was entirely broken to the saddle. He would do whatever the Krays required, whenever they required it, because the alternative was not just social ruin, but a prison sentence for perjury and fraud. This was the architecture of Boothby's private hell. He was a prisoner who had voluntarily handed the keys to a psychopath, applauded by the very government that built the cell. The mid-1960s accelerated. London was shifting. The Cultural Revolution was in full swing, but the criminal underworld was becoming increasingly unstable. The Kray twins were losing their grip on reality. Ronnie's paranoid schizophrenia worsened. His violence shifted from calculated business tactics to erratic, bloodthirsty paranoia. In 1966, Ronnie Kray walked into the Blind Beggar pub in Whitechapel and shot a rival gangster, George Cornell, point blank in the head in front of a room full of witnesses. When the news reached Boothby in his pristine West End apartment, the terror must have been absolute. He was intimately tied to an active, unhinged murderer. The men who provided his sexual escapes, the men who held the photographs of his most vulnerable moments, were now executing people in public houses. Every time the phone rang, Boothby jumped. Every knock at the door was the police. Every newspaper headline was a potential death sentence. He was anchored to a sinking, violently erratic ship, and he had thrown away the only knife he could have used to cut the rope. He could not go to the police. He could not go to his colleagues. MSI-5 was watching him, but they were not there to protect him. They were there to ensure he kept his mouth shut. The intelligence services monitored the Krays. They monitored Boothby, and they calculated the political mathematics of the situation. As long as Boothby maintained the lie, the government was safe. His psychological destruction was simply the cost of doing business. Boothby self-medicated the only way a man of his class could. He poured it into a glass. His alcoholism ceased to be a social habit and became a medical necessity. He drank to stop the shaking. He drank to forget the East End apartments, the flash of the camera bulbs, and the cold, dead eyes of Ronnie Kray. He drank to tolerate the reflection in the mirror, a man who had traded his soul for a title and a fake apology. His physical decline was rapid. The sharp, witty debater became bloated and erratic. His television appearances grew less frequent. Producers noticed the slurred speech, the unfocused eyes, the sudden flashes of undirected anger. The public chalked it up to old age and a fondness for good wine. The establishment knew exactly what it was. They watched him drink himself into oblivion and did absolutely nothing. A dead hero was vastly preferable to a living liability. To solidify the cover-up, the establishment required one final piece of stagecraft. In 1967, at the age of 67, Boothby suddenly married a woman 33 years his junior. It was a desperate, transparent maneuver. The marriage was a shield, a final concrete wall built to block any lingering rumors about his sexuality. He dragged another human being into his fortress of lies to serve as a prop for his fake morality. It was the ultimate act of a cornered, broken man. Meanwhile, the net was closing on the Krays. Scotland Yard, finally unshackled from the political interference that had protected the twins for years, launched a massive operation led by Detective Chief Superintendent Leonard Nipper Red. The wall of silence in the East End was cracking. In 1968, the police kicked down the doors. Ronnie and Reggie Kray were arrested for murder. The trial was a media sensation. The brutal reality of the Krays' empire was laid bare for the world to see. But missing from the testimony, meticulously scrubbed from the official record, was any mention of the politicians they had compromised. The establishment ensured that while the gangsters went down, they went down alone. Ronnie Kray was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. He was eventually certified insane and sent to Broadmoor Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility. When the guilty verdict was read, Boothby did not feel relief. He felt the cold, lingering dread of a man who knows the bomb has been defused, but the timer is still ticking in his head. Ronnie Kray was locked away, but the damage to Boothby was irreversible. The photographs were supposedly destroyed, but the memory of them was branded into his mind. He had spent the remainder of his life as a hostage. He had compromised his integrity, lied to his country, and destroyed his own spirit to protect a system that viewed him as nothing more than a disposable public relations asset. The 1970s and 1980s were a slow, agonizing fade. Boothby remained in the House of Lords, a ghost haunting the corridors of power. He was a monument to the hypocrisy of the British ruling class. He had survived the scandal of the century, but he had lost everything that made his life worth living. The 1970s arrived, bringing with them a profound and bitter irony for Lord Boothby. The world he had sacrificed his soul to hide from was rapidly changing. In 1967, the Sexual Offences Act was passed in the United Kingdom, decriminalizing homosexual acts in private between two men over the age of 21. It was a monumental shift in British law and society. The crushing, suffocating terror of imprisonment that had defined the existence of gay men in Britain for centuries was legally dismantled. Boothby himself had been an advocate for this reform. He had spoken in favor of the Wolfenden Report, the very document that laid the groundwork for the new legislation. He had used his intellect and his parliamentary privilege to argue for the basic human right to exist without the threat of the police kicking down a bedroom door. He helped unlock the cage for thousands of men across the country, but he could not unlock his own. The 1967 Act offered amnesty for the future, but it offered no salvation for Boothby's past. His specific tragedy was not merely that he was a homosexual. It was that he had committed perjury on national television, extorted the free press through libel laws, and colluded with a state intelligence apparatus to cover up an association with a murderous crime syndicate. The decriminalization of his sexuality did absolutely nothing to erase the criminality of his survival strategy. If he were to step into the light now, to embrace the new era of tolerance he had helped legislate, the foundation of his 1964 libel victory would disintegrate. The £40,000 payout would be exposed as a massive state-sponsored fraud. He would be stripped of his peerage, disgraced in the history books, and potentially prosecuted for perjury. He was legally free, but practically entombed. He was a pioneer who could never set foot in the promised land. He watched a new generation of men begin to live openly, frequenting clubs without the fear of blackmail, while he remained chained to the phantom of Ronnie Kray and the deafening silence of the British establishment. To maintain the fortress he had built, Boothby leaned heavily into his late-in-life marriage to Wanda Sana. The marriage was a masterpiece of aristocratic misdirection. She was a Sardinian woman, decades his junior. To the outside observer, it was the picture of an eccentric, wealthy lord enjoying his twilight years with a devoted young wife. In reality, it was a profound and mutual isolation. The marriage provided Boothby with the ultimate alibi. It was a human shield against the lingering whispers in the halls of Westminster. But what was the daily reality of that house? It was a residence built on an unspoken, ironclad contract of denial. They shared a name, a home, and a public image, but Boothby's core identity, his deepest desires, and his greatest terrors were completely walled off. He could not share the true source of his sudden panics, his reliance on the bottle, or the reason he froze whenever a certain name was mentioned on the evening news. He lived in intimate proximity with a woman who was married to a ghost. The loneliness of that existence, to be constantly observed but fundamentally unknown by the person sitting across the breakfast table, was a slow, quiet psychological execution. The contrast between Boothby's final decades and the fate of Ronnie Kray is the most jarring contradiction of this entire saga. Ronnie Kray had been declared criminally insane and sent to Broadmoor Hospital. He was stripped of his wealth, his bespoke suits, and his violent empire. He lived in a tiny cell in a high-security psychiatric ward. Yet, in a deeply perverse way, Ronnie Kray was infinitely freer than Lord Boothby. In Broadmoor, Ronnie did not have to pretend. He was openly, violently himself. He was a convicted murderer, a certified psychopath, and an openly gay man. He fully embraced his infamy. He received celebrity visitors, actors, and writers who sought out his dark charisma. He dictated his memoirs. He wore his crimes like medals. He never spent a single second of his incarceration pretending to be his pillar of moral virtue. He was a monster, and he owned his monstrosity. Boothby, on the other hand, was trapped in the gilded corridors of the House of Lords. He had access to the finest restaurants in London, the most exclusive clubs, and the ears of prime ministers. But he was terrified of his own shadow. Every step he took was calculated to project an image he fundamentally despised. He was a hostage to respectability. The gangster in the asylum was living his truth, however ugly. The aristocrat in the palace was dying of his lie. The human body can only process a finite amount of cognitive dissonance before it begins to shut down. Boothby's mind had brokered a corrupt deal with the state, but his physical form bore the entire cost of the transaction. His reliance on alcohol ceased to be a coping mechanism and morphed into a full-scale biological dependency. He did not drink for pleasure, he drank for anesthesia. He needed to numb the constant vibrating frequency of anxiety that hummed in his chest from the moment he woke up. Observers in the House of Lords noted his physical decay. The sharp, commanding orator of the 1950s was gone. In his place was a bloated, red-faced, breathless old man. His interventions in parliamentary debates became erratic and slurred. The brilliant mind that had once served Winston Churchill was drowning in a sea of gin and suppressed terror. The establishment, of course, maintained their polite fiction. They stepped around him. They offered polite nods. They pretended not to notice the smell of liquor radiating from him at 10 in the morning. They had purchased his silence, and they were content to watch the asset depreciate until it was written off entirely. Death, when it finally arrived on July 16, 1986, was a bureaucratic formality. Lord Boothby died at the age of 86 from cardiopulmonary arrest, heavily complicated by years of severe alcoholism. The reaction of the state was predictable and flawlessly executed. The machinery that had protected him in life was activated to sanitize him in death. The obituaries in the major broadsheets were glowing. They hailed him as a maverick, a brilliant parliamentarian, a pioneer of political television, and a devoted friend to the great men of history. They mentioned his charm, his wit, and his unwavering dedication to the Conservative Party. The Sunday Mirror scandal of 1964 was mentioned, but only as a minor, unfortunate footnote, a malicious rumor that the great man had successfully and righteously defeated in court. The narrative was cemented. The lie had outlived the man. The establishment had successfully defended its perimeter. Lord Boothby was buried with his honors intact, his secrets supposedly taking up residence in the grave alongside his cirrhotic liver. For nearly 30 years, the grave kept those secrets. The architects of the cover-up retired, aged, and died. The public forgot the specifics of the scandal, remembering Boothby only vaguely as a grand, old-world politician. The 40,000-pound libel victory stood as an unquestioned matter of legal and historical record. But truth possesses a relentless, corrosive quality. It eats through the thickest steel vaults eventually. In 2015, the landscape of British secrecy shifted. Under pressure for transparency, the National Archives began declassifying thousands of historical intelligence documents. Among them were the tightly guarded, heavily redacted MI5 files detailing the agency's monitoring of the Kray twins in the early 1960s. When researchers and journalists finally opened those manila folders, the entire meticulously constructed facade of the British establishment collapsed in an instant. The files contained absolute, irrefutable proof. The intelligence services knew everything. The documents detailed MI5's deep awareness of Lord Boothby's sexual relationship with Ronnie Kray. They contained informant reports outlining the very sex parties that Boothby had so vehemently denied attending under oath. More damningly, the files revealed the sheer scale of the political panic in 1964. They documented the frantic communications between the heads of intelligence, senior police officials, and the highest ranks of the conservative government. The documents proved that the decision to crush the Sunday Mirror was not based on the newspaper publishing a falsehood. It was based entirely on the newspaper publishing the truth. The libel trial of 1964 was exposed not as a victory for a defamed man, but as a coordinated state-sponsored attack on the free press to protect a compromised politician. Cecil King and the editors of the Sunday Mirror had been right all along. They had been threatened, financially extorted, and publicly humiliated by a legal system that was weaponized by the ruling class to protect its own power. The revelation was a retroactive earthquake. It completely rewrote the history of British journalism and politics in the 1960s. It laid bare the absolute ruthlessness of the establishment. They had not just protected Lord Boothby, they had deployed the national intelligence apparatus to ensure that a member of the House of Lords could safely maintain an active relationship with London's most dangerous murderous crime syndicate, simply to avoid a public relations disaster for the Conservative Party. They had sacrificed the integrity of the law, the freedom of the press, and the mental sanity of Lord Boothby himself on the altar of class reputation. The Boothby-Kray scandal was not a story of a brave man defending his honor against a vicious tabloid. It was a tragedy of cowardice, exploitation, and institutional corruption. Lord Boothby was a victim, yes. He was a victim of a homophobic society that criminalized his nature, forcing him into the shadows where predators like Ronnie Kray operated. He was a victim of his own aristocratic arrogance, believing he could dabble in the violent underworld without getting his hand severed. And he was a victim of the very establishment he served, which viewed his life merely as a structural column supporting their own authority, a column they were willing to reinforce with lies, intimidation, and fraud to keep the roof from caving in. But Boothby was also an active collaborator in his own destruction. He possessed a choice in 1964. He could have chosen ruin. He could have accepted the destruction of his career, stood in the wreckage, and told the truth. It would have been a catastrophic, humiliating end to his political life, but he would have reclaimed his autonomy. Instead, he chose a comfortable, gilded slavery. He chose to look into a television camera and lie to the public that trusted him, securing his peerage at the absolute cost of his humanity. The tragedy of Lord Bob Boothby is the terrifying realization that you can win the lawsuit, keep the title, secure the money, and retain the admiration of the elite while completely and irrevocably losing your own soul. He survived the scandal of the century, but the man who emerged from the fire was nothing more than an empty suit, animated by fear and owned entirely by the state. The ink on the 40,000-pound check had barely dried before the real work of the establishment began. Paying off Lord Boothby was merely the public spectacle. The private objective was absolute deterrence. The British state did not just want to win the news cycle, they wanted to castrate Fleet Street permanently. To understand the sheer magnitude of the state's reaction in July 1964, one must look at the political calendar. The Boothby cover-up was not an isolated reflex. It was an act of desperate, terminal panic by a ruling class that was already bleeding out. The British establishment in the early 1960s was undergoing a brutal public dismantling. The illusion of their moral superiority had been shattered by a sequence of devastating scandals. In 1962, John Vassall, a civil servant in the Admiralty, was exposed as a Soviet spy. Vassall was a homosexual who had been caught in a honey trap and blackmailed by the KGB. The government was humiliated. It proved that the state's archaic punitive laws regarding sexuality were not protecting the nation. They were actively creating catastrophic security vulnerabilities. A year later, the floor fell out completely. The Profumo affair of 1963 destroyed the government of Harold Macmillan. John Profumo, the Secretary of State for War, had shared a 19-year-old mistress, Christine Keeler, with a Soviet naval attaché. Profumo stood up in the House of Commons and lied about it. When the truth emerged, it nearly brought down the entire political system. The Profumo affair taught the conservative government a lethal lesson about public perception and the press. They learned that the media, if left unchecked, could destroy centuries of entrenched power in a matter of weeks. The establishment resolved that they would never again allow themselves to be humiliated by the tabloids. They drew a hard line. Then came the summer of 1964. The conservative government, now led by Alec Douglas Home, was just months away from a general election they were terrified of losing. When the Sunday Mirror published The Peer and the Gangster, the political calculus in Whitehall was instantaneous and ice cold. Another sex scandal, another lie, another intersection of the highest levels of government with the lowest elements of society, this time involving the most violent mafia syndicate in London, would guarantee electoral annihilation. Lord Boothby was not saved out of loyalty or affection. He was saved because the system simply did not have the structural integrity to survive his destruction. They succeeded. The Boothby-Kray cover-up became the blueprint for institutional silence in the United Kingdom for the next half-century. It established a terrifying precedent. Truth is irrelevant if it threatens the architecture of class power. Examine the mechanics of this suppression. It was not orchestrated in a smoke-filled room by comic book villains. It was executed in broad daylight through the polite, ruthless application of British libel law. In the United States, a public figure suing a newspaper must prove actual malice. They must prove the paper knew the information was false. In Britain, the burden is inverted. The newspaper must prove the statement is entirely demonstrably true. In a case involving a mafia boss, clandestine sex parties, and terrified young men, obtaining sworn testimony is impossible. The law was perfectly designed to protect men with dangerous secrets. This cover-up required the active complicity of the press barons. Cecil King, the head of the Mirror Group, was no coward. He commanded a media empire. But when the Boothby story broke, King was not fighting a politician. He was fighting the crown. The pressure applied to him was total. Bank loans were threatened. Social invitations were rescinded. The message was delivered through whispers at gentlemen's clubs in St. James's. Back down, or we will dismantle your life. Furthermore, King was an ambitious man who craved political influence and a peerage of his own. The back-channel negotiations were brutal. The government essentially offered him a choice: pursue the Boothby story and become an enemy of the state, ensuring the destruction of your social and political ambitions, or retract the story, take the financial hit, and remain a member of the club. King chose the club. He capitulated. He printed the apology, paid the blood money, and sacrificed his journalists alongside the truth. It was a masterful, cynical deployment of soft power. The chilling effect on British journalism was immediate and catastrophic. Investigative reporters watched the biggest Sunday paper in the country get gutted in public. They learned the lesson the state intended to teach. Do not investigate the bedroom habits of the ruling class. Do not look into the intersection of high society and organized crime. For decades, journalists sat on mountains of evidence regarding political corruption and massive financial fraud, paralyzed by the memory of Lord Boothby. The establishment bought decades of immunity for £40,000. It was the cheapest insurance policy in political history. Meanwhile, in the East End, the Krays were emboldened to a terrifying degree. The Boothby cover-up was the ultimate proof of concept for Ronnie Kray. He had tested the perimeter of the British establishment, and he had found it weak. He had learned that the elite would protect a violent criminal if exposing the criminal meant exposing themselves. The Kray's blackmail operation was not a haphazard side hustle. It was an industrialized economy. They ran gambling clubs, like the notorious Esmeralda's barn in Knightsbridge, specifically designed to draw in the upper classes. They provided the alcohol, the gambling, and the young men. They recorded the debts, and they took the photographs. They understood that in a society that criminalized homosexuality, a camera was a more effective weapon than a gun. A gun could only kill a man. A photograph could command him. The societal homophobia of the era was not just a moral failing. It was the foundational infrastructure of organized crime. The state, by passing laws that criminalized human nature, artificially created a massive black market. The Krays simply monopolized it. They did not invent the hypocrisy of the British elite. They merely monetized it. Boothby was the crown jewel of this operation, but he was not the only victim. The Krays constructed a network of compromised politicians, judges, and police officers. The immunity they enjoyed throughout the 1960s, the ability to run extortion rackets, commit assaults, and eventually commit murder in broad daylight, was directly financed by the silence of men like Lord Boothby. Every time Boothby drank himself into a stupor to forget the East End, he was paying the psychological tax for the Kray's violent expansion. But the most sinister element of the cover-up, the ultimate betrayal of the public trust, was the role of MI5. The British Security Service is tasked with protecting the realm from espionage, sabotage, and subversion. In 1964, at the height of the Cold War, they diverted resources to act as a private protection racket for a conservative peer. Declassified files reveal that MI5 had the Kray twins under intense surveillance. They knew Ronnie Kray was a homicidal schizophrenic, building a criminal empire. They knew he was running extortion rackets, and they knew he was sharing a bed with Lord Bob Boothby. MI5 agents intercepted communications and gathered informant reports detailing the exact locations of the sex parties. They possessed the intelligence required to arrest Ronnie Kray and dismantle his operation years before he murdered George Cornell in a Whitechapel pub. They possessed the intelligence to privately force Boothby to resign, mitigating the national security risk of a blackmailed peer. They did neither. The senior civil servants in Whitehall made a calculated, cold-blooded decision. Taking down the Krays meant exposing Boothby. Exposing Boothby meant exposing the Conservative Party to a catastrophic moral scandal right before a general election. The math was simple. The political survival of the ruling class outweighed the safety of the citizens of London. They allowed a violent syndicate to operate with impunity because the Mafia held the collateral of the state. This is the ultimate definition of institutional corruption. The state did not fail to do its job. It actively weaponized its power against the public interest. It protected a predator to protect a politician. This stark reality becomes violently clear when contrasted with the fate of Stephen Ward, the osteopath who had introduced Profumo to Keeler just a year prior. Ward was a well-connected socialite, but he lacked a title. He lacked aristocratic blood. When the Profumo scandal detonated, the establishment needed a scapegoat. They abandoned Ward. They prosecuted him ruthlessly on trumped-up charges of living off immoral earnings. The pressure was designed to break him, and it did. Stephen Ward took a fatal overdose the night before the verdict was delivered. The system killed him to cleanse itself. A year later, Lord Boothby committed offenses that were arguably far more damaging. He associated with active homicidal criminals and engaged in a massive fraud against the press. But Boothby possessed a peerage. He was an Eton boy. He was a friend of Churchill. You do not put a lord in the dock for sleeping with gangsters. You bury the press for pointing it out. Ward was disposable because of his class. Boothby was impenetrable because of his. The establishment proved they possessed the exact same moral compass as Ronnie Kray. Loyalty is dictated by utility and leverage, nothing else. Boothby's tragedy is often framed as a personal failing, a man who gave in to his darker appetites. That is a convenient fiction. It places the blame entirely on his shoulders. The reality is far more brutal. Boothby was a product of his environment. He was bred in a system that taught him he was untouchable. He was educated at Eton and Oxford. institutions that instilled the belief that the rules applying to the working class did not apply to him. When he walked into the East End and paid for the company of dangerous men, he did not believe he was risking his career. He believed his class provided absolute immunity. He was half right. The class did provide immunity, but it demanded his soul as collateral. The tragedy lies in the absolute lack of solidarity within the elite. The moment Boothby became a liability, his peers in Parliament and the intelligence services did not rally to help him. They rallied to contain him. They viewed him precisely the way Ronnie Kray viewed him, as an asset to be managed. This protection looked like a conspiracy of silence in the loudest rooms in Britain. When Lord Boothby walked into the House of Lords, after securing his £40,000 libel payout, he was not walking into a room of fools. The men occupying those red leather benches were former intelligence officers, cabinet ministers, and seasoned political operatives. They read the intelligence briefings. They heard the whispers from the police commissioners at their private clubs. Every single man in that chamber knew Boothby was lying. They knew he was a compromised asset. Yet they stood up, approached him, and shook his hand. They congratulated him on defeating the malicious tabloid press. They participated in a daily choreographed pantomime of respect. This is the most suffocating aspect of Boothby's psychological prison. He knew that they knew. He lived the rest of his life surrounded by peers who silently judged him as a liability, yet publicly upheld him as a paragon of virtue. It is one thing to lie and successfully deceive the world. It is a far more agonizing fate to lie, know that everyone around you knows it is a lie, and be forced to endlessly perform the deception anyway. It was a mutual hostage situation. The House of Lords became a theater of the absurd, where the price of admission was collective delusion. The public, meanwhile, was complicit in its own deception. In the 1960s, the British working and middle classes possessed a deep, ingrained deference to the aristocracy. They wanted to believe the booming, confident man on the television screen. They wanted to believe that the men governing them were morally superior. When Boothby looked into the camera and called the allegations a wicked lie, the public eagerly swallowed it. It was easier to believe that a tabloid newspaper was malicious than to accept that a friend of Winston Churchill was a compromised, terrified hostage of a schizophrenic gangster. This culture of deference is the soil in which the cover-up grew. The establishment could only execute their lie because the public was primed to accept it. The Boothby Kray scandal is a masterclass in the mechanics of power. It demonstrates that power is not just the ability to pass laws or command armies. True power is the ability to dictate reality. It is the ability to look at a black sky, call it white, and force the rest of the country to agree with you under threat of financial and social ruin. He spent the last 2 decades of his life as a wealthy, decorated ghost, haunting the institutions that had simultaneously protected and destroyed him. The ultimate irony is that by burying the truth, the establishment ensured its eventual explosive resurrection. When the archives finally opened, the elite were exposed not just as hypocrites, but as active conspirators in a criminal cover-up. Ronnie Kray traded his freedom for the brutal satisfaction of owning a lord. The British establishment traded its fundamental legitimacy to protect a single flawed man, leaving a scar of cynicism on the political landscape that has never fully healed. As for Lord Boothby, he survived the scandal of the century, keeping his title until his dying day. But the man who occupied that title was entirely hollowed out. Ultimately, The architect of his own gilded cage, he spent his final chapters not as a titan of the British Empire, but as a compromised asset. Owned by Ronnie Kray, managed by MI5, and paralyzed by a secret he could never confess, he won the 40,000-pound libel case. Yet he lost his life long before his heart finally stopped beating.